Okay. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Colorado Wildfire Risk Assessment, Improved Tools and Analysis for Learning webinar. This is session 1 of 2 sessions of webinars. This will be offering a general overview, giving an overall introduction to the use and planning potential of this assessment. Chad Julian and Nick Kotlinski and their team have been hard at work on this, and they'll give you some background. Please post your questions and comments and related links to Chad and myself, Steve Orr of Fire Adapted Colorado, and Rebecca Samolsky of Fire Adapted Colorado will be facilitating chat. As you join us, please be sure to, you're welcome to put your affiliation and your location, city and state. If you're with an agency, please let us know what district or where you're hailing from. With that, Nick, could you give us to the next slide, please? Just a couple of points to make before we move forward. The presentation is being recorded going forward. The presentation will be through both Nick Kotlinski, who will be giving a general introduction, and then Chad Julian will be going through examples and some technical aspects. Nick Kotlinski will wind it up. We'll have an outro and then open it up for question and answer and discussion. You're welcome to keep your video on, as it lets us know that humans are really out there, but please keep your audio off as we move forward. The webinar, as I mentioned, will be recorded. The video will be edited and posted to the Southern Rockies Fire Science Network YouTube channel, and I'll put that in chat. Continuing education credits are being offered through the Society of American Foresters for Category 1, 1.5 continuing education credits. We'll be taking the attendee roster and timestamps from Zoom and turning that in and working to the Society of American Foresters and working with them to confer credits. Be sure to register for the second in the series. We'll put the link in again. And we do have some polls. I'm going to launch this as we get started. Have you used the CO-WRA in the past? We thought we would toss that in there and get some background information for our tool developers. Nick, and I think unless Steve or Becca, I would like to introduce Becca and Steve. Can you put on your videos real quick? We are co-hosting with the generous support of Fire Adapted Colorado. Becca Samolsky is the executive director, and Steve Orr is program manager. Do you have anything to add before we launch?
Just excited that this tool is finally coming out with the update. So look forward to seeing it from you guys. And I know there's still some more to the rollout. So, and we want to make sure this is available for people who can't make it today. So appreciate you, Gloria, recording it and also having the second session available in September for those who want to get more into the techie side or just missed today. So if there's somebody you know who couldn't make it, we'll get you that registration link here in a minute for the second one in September.
Okay, and I'm handing this over to Nick. I'm closing the poll here. Well, I guess I'll let it run for just a little bit. Nick? Over to you, and our attendants, please be sure to keep yourself muted. You're welcome to put on your video, and thank you for joining us.
Gloria, and yeah, thanks everybody for joining today. We're super excited to give everybody an overview of the 2022 Colorado Wildfire Risk Assessment. It was officially launched yesterday on the Colorado Forest Atlas. My name is Nick Kotlinski. I'm the Geospatial Data and Analysis Program Manager at the Colorado State Forest Service. I'm also presenting today with Chad Julian, who's a Wildfire Mitigation Program Specialist with CSFS. Many of you may have seen us present various previews of this presentation and this data in the past, but we're excited to finally be able to officially release this updated risk assessment going forward. So for some background, the Colorado Wildfire Risk Assessment, or COWRA for short, and the associated applications are a statewide assessment, and get a pop-up. And these were designed to increase wildfire awareness, provide a comprehensive view of wildfire risk, educate users about wildfire prevention and mitigation resources, all of which are available from the Colorado State Forest Service. So COWRA has been updated traditionally on a 5-year cycle. So it was first released in 2012 and updated in 2017. And the 2022 update, which is now being released in 2023. I'll just point out that the updates are usually developed in the year prior to release. So we often refer to them by the year in which the last data was available for analysis. So I want to highlight some of the major changes that have been introduced with the latest update compared to our previous release. The overall goal of this update was to provide better resolution products, including a focus on building level metrics, while still providing a statewide assessment. So to reach that goal, we've developed products at a 20-meter resolution and with a suite of building level risk metrics that we then aggregated up to a neighborhood level to better inform local planning than was available in the past. And we'll talk more later about why that aggregation happened and what you can still do with that data. We obviously also wanted to provide better wildfire risk and behavior products based on improved fuels and input data sets. So we really worked hard to develop a fuels layer that includes custom fuels developed by our contractor Technosylva and further refined by a team of subject matter experts. So the fuels layers were developed using available statewide LiDAR, building footprints and machine learning modeling to fill in gaps. And this ultimately led to a more refined product overall across the state. So we're really excited about this release. So I want to highlight the team that worked on this project. So our contractors for the project were Technosylva, and their team has been behind the bulk of the project management, data processing, and modeling work. The Colorado State Forest Service team was really strengthened during this update by some new additions to our wildfire program, including Chad Julian, Todd Ruffner, and Dan Beveridge. Providing a lot of knowledge and insight. And then Amanda Fordham and her experience with the previous assessment. And then finally, our fuels team was comprised of an interagency group of fuels experts who really drove the outcome of the fuels product, which ultimately underpins the rest of the risk assessment analysis. So we're really grateful for their time and support. I also want to mention that we've, as we work through these updates, we've really taken seriously all the requests for improvements and concerns that we've got from users across the state and really tried to make improvements based on those comments. And also a big thank you to the many people who have reviewed these products at various stages as they've come about and provided feedback on the process and outputs. I know Chad has talked to a lot of people as we've led up to this release. And so really thankful for all those contributions as well. So this is kind of the broad framework model that we show for this update. I think our partners at Technosylva would be a lot better to kind of dive into all this, but really we're going to go over this process throughout this presentation. And so I don't want to spend too much time on it, but the gist is that we worked on method design, data collection, processing, and fuels development really intensively at the start of the project to make sure we were teed up for everything else to come. Once that step was completed, the technical team at Technosylva really took it over and started running their fire modeling simulations across the state and did a lot of validation. And then finally, the risk assessment layers were developed, refined, and finalized from those fire model outputs with a lot of input from the CSFS team, and then again, a lot of outside support. So this slide is highlighting the input layers and data preparation methodology that went into the fuels layer primarily, but also informed the rest of the data outputs. So satellite and airborne imagery were used across the state, with Sentinel-2 providing the best spectral resolution, and that is also what set our 20-meter spatial resolution used in our outputs. Ancillary data sets like landfire were used to validate outputs. Other layers like building footprints were used to define the spatial focus of other outputs. US crop layer, fire history, and disturbance data were used to modify the fuels layer. LiDAR was used in the modeling process to extract fine resolution elevation metrics and some surface characteristics in the modeling process. I want to point out the novel part of this risk assessment, or one of the novel parts of it, is the use of object-based image analysis, which is a method of combining pixels into groups or segments of similar characteristics. So through a process of defining spectral, textural, and contextual characteristics, and then a little bit of trial and error in the software to set parameter weighting, you get the boundaries of these segments set. And Technosylva created thousands, tens of thousands of polygons across the state that were then used as the units for classification and statistical analysis of the fuels layer, which avoided some of the pixel confusion in the modeling process later on. So I point this out also because this is going to be a noticeable visual change when people look at the fuels product, but one that ultimately I think provides better results. The fuels model classification, this occurred across a number of processing and verification steps. So using all that spectral elevation and ancillary input data that I just showed, and then combined with some machine learning modeling, Technosylva produced their initial fuels layer for review. That model was further trained and validated by the Technosylva team using NAPE imagery and Google Street View. So they did kind of a remote reconnaissance to start validation. And then after some initial improvements, they sent us some focal sample areas to the CSFS team and the fuels team that we then sent to foresters in the areas around those focal areas to collect further ground truthing using Survey 123. And so that data was then sent back to Technosylva, and that really helped them further refine their algorithms for areas that were of special interest to CSFS and Technosylva. And then the final step was that further refinement was done by the fuels team to reclassify some specific fuel types, which we do have an example of later, to ultimately reach our final fuels layer. So here's the final fuels output, which Chad's going to zoom into for some examples in a little bit. But I did want to just provide an example of an area where LiDAR wasn't available, or show a comparison of where LiDAR was available and where it wasn't, and just show kind of like how continuous the model is using that machine learning algorithm, just to give us a smooth fuels layer, even where we didn't have the higher resolution data available. So it did a pretty good job of stretching across those boundaries. So now I'm going to pass it to Chad actually to do the next couple slides.
Chad, come off mute, please.
Hey, thank you. A real pleasure to have everybody on the call today. Thanks, Nick, for transitioning that over. We've spent a lot of quality time, I think, making some really good improvements at finer resolutions that are going to be really noticed here in the next few slides. Nick's already talked about the fuels work that we had. We began with the fuels team. And what that led to were some custom timber fuel type models that were created. As folks on the call know, we can start with the Scott and Burgan 40 fuel models that we have as choices, but it's always good to try to tweak those for some of the local conditions if you have that information, and we were able to do that in this process. They also were able to do some simulation work, which is what this slide's showing, to see how those custom fuel models compared to the regular Scott and Burgan timber fuel models we had used previously. And we compared that to some of the fires we had in 2020 in Colorado, as well as some of the fires that had been happening in California, where they had went through this similar process. So we wanted to show this slide to show, at least on the right, when you're using these more custom fuel models, they're fitting into better into expectation. Next slide, Nick. And the other thing that really drives a lot of this, a lot of what we look at in the fuel types that are timber are the canopy fuel layers. And as folks know, when we take stuff directly out of land fire, there can sometimes be some misinterpretations of what is occurring there. And so these guys decided to do some, with the object-based image analysis, there was better ways to calculate the canopy characteristics. And you can see these two graphs on the right that show you how things matched up better in that world. Next slide, Nick. But this is, I think, where the rubber really hits the road. The fuels classification and what fuel models we chose are really the most important aspect of what's going to drive everything in this assessment. The image on the left is northern Colorado. You can see the park range, or what we know as the circles there in the far left, that's kind of going north to south in trend. And then in the middle center of the image towards the right is the area around where East Troublesome burned, because you can see its evidence on the image on the right there, where it's a tan footprint that matches the fire footprint. But what I wanted to note on the image on the left here is that you see the bluish color that dominated what we kind of, if folks know that portion in northern Colorado, is predominantly a lot of lodgepole pine and spruce fir mix. And previously, with the land fire derived models, or outputs coming into play, it was labeled as timber litter 1, and that doesn't give a lot of good fire behavior. Doesn't meet expected fire behavior outputs when you're in extreme conditions like we're modeling. So our previous version really probably downplayed those outputs by that model that was chosen to kind of dominate those cover types there. If you notice the photo on the right for 2022, a lot of that bluish color has shifted to a greener color. And that is this timber understory dynamic fuel model that was created by Technosylva. That is allowing us to have a better fuel model to kind of match up with the expected fire behavior outputs. And by making a timber understory versus a timber litter, that's helping us to get closer to reality in those cover types. We're not completely classifying the dead fuel component that's present and change fuel conditions, though, that are in those more serious insect affected stands. That is going to be something we're going to try to get a little better at in the next assessment. But the fire behavior outputs are more believable now, though, just by shifting to the timber understory. On the other side of the coin, what we did was for pinyon juniper, where previously we had more grass, shrub, and shrub fuel models, we've created a customized timber litter model for those that's downplaying the fire behavior outputs to meet more of the expectation for that cover type as compared to what we had previously. Next slide, Nick. So this area is around Steamboat Springs. The photo on the left kind of shows the 2017 fuels layer. And one area that I'm kind of highlighting and picking on here is the area that's circled in white. It's known as Emerald Mountain, upwind and southwest of Steamboat Springs. Previously, when we had the classifications there, which I don't have in the legend, we were downplaying the fire behavior outputs some. Again, we did have a lot of timber litter on the right in the image, which has been replaced by quite a bit of green. And this object-based image analysis has led to, I think, better classification of the fuels. That grouping, which you can see evidence of in the right image, if you know the mountain front of the Steamboat ski area there, that's, I think, classifying it fairly well with the shrub understory that's present in a lot of those aspen stands that folks don't see when they're skiing in the winter. The stuff that's on Emerald Mountain there, because we've shifted to more of this dynamic timber understory model, it's helping to kind of help factor in fuel curing throughout the season, and the custom nature of what they created in the simulation work they did on our 2020 fires and the stuff in California has given a lot more confidence in what those custom fuels are. So I just wanted to show kind of an example here around Steamboat Springs. The other thing to note is the urban areas. Previously, we didn't have much resolution on those, and they kind of just colored out gray. When you see the image on the right, we did create a lot of urban field models that I'll talk about here in a later slide. Next slide, Nick, which is this one. And you'll see that there were, I think, maybe 15 or 16 of them here that we created. Different fuel loadings around different type of road corridors, agricultural lands that had different type of fuel loadings, golf courses, and those types of things to give us much better resolution in some of these urban areas, especially along the Front Range. In particular, I've seen a major improvement there. Next slide. So this just shows how we approach the fire behavior modeling. There's lots of different software packages that folks could choose to use. There are conventional ones like FlamMap and Behave and Farsight, and those that folks are familiar with. What Technosylva used was their own proprietary system. I think it's called Wildfire Analyst, and folks on the call may have used that as well. So that the input data that we've kind of talked about, there have been improvements there where we've done better things with the object-based image analysis. Our fuel layer is more accurate, and the like. We did improvements on the canopy characteristics of what we did get out of land fire. So with all those improvements, as well as coupled up with some better weather information and approaches that were factored in, and using then their software, we were able to start to get these fire behavior outputs created, and that I think are meeting expectation a lot more as compared to the previous update. And we do also have some dynamic fire simulations that try to factor in, again, some of the fuel curing and other things throughout the season. It gives us these outputs that we are able to help to estimate fire risk. So impacts on building. We've got a building damage factor, a damage assessment piece that we'll be showing you, as well as defensible space, ingress and egress, terrain difficulty index, and some other ways we look at fire risk, which we'll share in some of the upcoming slides. Next slide. So wanted to show you here where it's changed in pinyon juniper. When you previously can see things on the two left images there, the bottom left image we see now is timber litter, which we previously had classified a lot of our lodgepole and spruce fir as. But now what we've done on the pinyon juniper is change that from more of the grass shrub and shrub field model series to more of a timber litter, and tried to customize that as well. That's, I think, leading to better fire behavior outputs. It also changes what happens with the burn probability with the ignitions that we throw into that type, because being a timber litter, a lot of them aren't going to spread compared to when they're grass shrub, or shrub. A lot of our ignitions then spread when we choose those field models in it. Some of the folks I've chatted with in the field feel this will fit expectations better for pinyon juniper. There are sites, though, probably that are on slightly higher productivity sites, or if there is more of a grass component, that they may follow more of that historical grass, and shrub field model type and those type of outputs. And I think the coal data set is tilted a little more in that direction in the pinyon juniper due to the models they've chosen with shrub, the shrub series and grass. We're more on the timber litter. So both data sets may have some applicability depending on how productive your site is and if grass is present or not, especially if you're in Southeast Colorado, where I think there's more grass present in some of those pinyon juniper sites than there is on some of the more unproductive sites out on the western slope. Next slide. So we wanted to kind of sum up what we think a lot of these themes are that we can give you as an overview that you're going to see in the professional risk viewer, which I just looked at here this morning as data has been put in there. We do have quite a few wildfire risk themes. Fire intensity is one of those fire behavior outputs that I think is an excellent one to use, especially in more of your low probability systems like lodgepole, pine, and spruce. I think it's fairly acceptable to show that as kind of a proxy for risk, what that intensity could become. Burn probability is something we have as a standalone layer that you can turn on and off. That does have some things that drive it, though, that we do not have some control over, that it downplays the burn probability in some areas of the state. the fire reporting of non-federal ignitions and federal ignitions are one of the drivers of that. And we have fairly good data on federal fire ignitions. We do have some holes in non-federal fire ignitions, especially in some of the rural areas of Western Colorado, where not all the fires are necessarily reported. So we miss some of those fires and probably downplay the burn probability slightly in those areas due to that. We also have a new layer that's called wildfire risk to assets that I'll highlight here in one of the subsequent few slides. And then we have some wildfire effects themes. We've got wildland-urban interface risk, and I think that's more improved and more accurate due to our fuels being more accurate on the front end. We've got the values at risk as well. Forest assets, the risk to those, as we define what the forest assets are and what those are, how valuable those are for us. Riparian assets. The watershed protection risk is replacing the old drinking water layer that we had. This is a bigger, more encompassing layer that tries to factor in a lot of other things that we look at in watershed protection beyond just solely drinking water. And then terrain difficulty index. That's a little different than suppression difficulty index, and we've looked kind of at both, and we felt this was a better one to go with for this assessment. The other thing that we've added are these wildfire behavior themes. We've got good, I think, fire behavior outputs based on our fuels being more accurate up on the front end. So the rate of spread that we've modeled for you at these are all modeled at 97 percentile conditions. So we've got rate of spread, spotting under those conditions. And then I've added a separate spotting layer that's based on 50-mile-an-hour average wind speeds, because when we're modeling to a 97 percentile condition statewide, I think that wind speed was only about 20 or 25 miles an hour. So I wanted a separate layer that folks could turn on to see what a 50-mile-an-hour average wind speed kind of looks like at a 97 percentile condition, to have a better conversation starter about some of the potential connections under those more extreme conditions for branding into our communities. Fire type, intensity, flame length, and then the dynamic one, characteristic flame length, which factors in backing, flanking, and head fire, whereas the regular flame length only factors in head fire. Next slide. So this is for folks on the call who have used our product previously. The one we're putting front and center up front is our composite wildfire risk that's in the themes that you can go to in the wildfire risk reduction planner. And this one, again, what you do notice on it is there's still some areas where we have lowest risk showing up. And again, there's one driver on that. That's one of our, is the non-federal fire ignitions reporting that we're probably downplaying because of ignitions we're missing. But as you do notice an area kind of around Granby that we're starting to look at, because our fuels are more accurate, it's started to make some improvements to this layer in particular. But due to the fact that, you know, there still are some greener holes out there, there are some other layers, next slide, that I wanted to show you that you can use if you're not seeing necessarily on that composite wildfire risk that, you know, can be to your benefit. This is looking at the fire intensity in that same area that, again, showing some lower risk on the composite side to our valued assets. But when you look at the fire intensity, this starts to show you how it's an acceptable example to start to show whether you have high and highest intensity. That does equate to a proxy for risk in those, again, low probability systems that we have in our higher elevations. And this would be an acceptable tool and layer to be able to start to demonstrate that, where a composite score might show you a lower score when we rate and factor in all the weightings. Next slide. This one here is a layer that we created that's new this time. It's our values at risk rating. And what this looks at are 4 layers that we value: the wildland-urban interface where people live, the forest assets layer that folks are familiar with from our forest action plan, the watershed protection areas, and the riparian assets. And so we had changed with some, we tinkered with some weightings and tried some experimentation over the last 2 weeks here towards the end of the assessment to see if we could make sure we had some tools available for folks to demonstrate and, you know, visualize risk the way that they need to, and that fits some of the expectations and local knowledge you have in some of these areas. And so when you looked at the previous slide, we're not going to bring back up, but the composite wildfire risk, that is the composite wildfire risk to these assets in this layer. But showing it this way without a burn probability factored in to make a risk layer that way, what we're showing you is a different way that you can highlight some of your valuable assets. So looking around Granby, for instance, here where previous versions would have shown the lowest risk category in our composite, a layer like this, you're able to show where the WUI shows out red, where some of our forest assets like spruce, for instance, are showing out moderate, or some of our lodgepole, we're able to kick up a category to low, and outside of the WUI areas. And then where we have some of the watershed protection areas, those start to color out on these as well. So this is a really acceptable layer to consider in your analysis, especially as you're doing bigger scale CWPPs, to really see what the values at risk rating is, especially in your areas where the composite on the western slope in more rural areas may not benefit you as much. Next slide. This one here is I got to remember which one this is. This is the watershed protection layer. And again, I think this one's been improved because it's not solely about drinking water. I know, in some of our internal discussions, we talked about ag water use, irrigation. 80% of our water in the state is going to agriculture. So we wanted to make sure we were trying to factor in all these water uses. And this layer's been updated. Amanda worked hard on getting this from CDPHE. So I really see some improvements compared to what we had previously with the drinking water assets. And again, use this as a layer to look at and tell some compelling stories as you can highlight risk to this through this lens from watershed protection when you look at this one here, instead of at times maybe using, say, for instance, that composite wildfire risk score. Next slide. This one here is showing you the wildland-urban interface risk. So there's two ways we can look at it. The image on the left there is showing you more building density and locations of things so that you get an idea of where WUI is, but how dense it is. The one on the right is showing you more of the risk from our low category all the way to the highest. And there are some things to think about as you look at the risk to the wildland-urban interface in that right slide. It's not factoring in branding that can go far distance into communities. It's not factoring in urban conflagrations that can happen when you do catch homes in tighter urban environments on fire. What it is factoring in is conditional flame length, which is that dynamic fire output that we have. And so it's telling you that really conduction with that direct flame length, that's probably the dominant factor here with a little bit of radiant. So the homes that you see in this layer are really a snapshot of the highest risk homes, with those caveats again that we're not factoring homes further in from branding and we're not factoring in those urban conflagrations. So there are homes that still could be at risk that wouldn't show up on this layer. Again, I think it's the snapshot of your highest risk homes. Next slide. So this is over in Steamboat Springs. It's going to give you an example of the two spotting layers and really how to potentially use them to your advantage when you're meeting with communities to show and tell some compelling stories. This one, again, is a lot of what we would use in our industry where we're modeling to percentile conditions, showing fire behavior outputs. But here what we're doing is, because we're modeling to percentile weather conditions, our wind is probably underestimated when we look at that specific metric. And so you can see what the spotting distances are here. They're generally, a half mile or so, and that's realistic. When you go to the next slide, this is under more of the 50-mile-an-hour spotting scenario. And so what you notice is most of the fuel types kind of double in their spotting distance. So this was a slide we showed in Steamboat Springs during a conference back in late April to kind of tell a compelling story that there is a chance that you could brand into town simultaneously. It's not a high annual risk, no, but if you project out in a 10-year period, are there some time periods where this could come to fruition under certain conditions? Yes. So is that something the community would want to consider in its Community Wildfire Protection Plan that Routt County, was updating this year? Next slide. And so there are quite a few things that we can talk about from the characteristics of the community. And so what we tried to develop for those were 3 output layers: building damage potential, defensible space, and ingress and egress. Now, how we've sampled those in the community scale to get down to that finer resolution is we've looked at, we put things in these hexagon shapes that are about 28 acres in size. And what we've been able to do with those is overlay those over the structures. So we're not showing damage potential to individual structures, especially in urban areas. It's a composite score of what's underneath that hexagon shape. And when we look at very rural areas where there aren't hardly any homes, the benefit that those folks will get is that if there is only one home under those hexagons, that is going to be the score for that home. How we did these two layers, though, the building damage potential and defensible space, is we chose to do buffer distances of 300 feet. And that'll be fairly important here in the next few slides I show you. And then we are looking at ingress and egress. We have a static layer that it will be able to show you here, but there are some big assumptions you have to take into account if you're going to use that layer. Next slide. So this is looking at the building damage potential in Steamboat Springs for folks who know that area. What you can see are the black structures underneath the hexagons that then make up the score. That's the composite score for that hexagon. The factors that we're looking at are fuels, slope, aspect, landform, building density, and then I think the key here is conditional flame length. So again, we're not factoring in branding going into town, and we're not factoring in urban conflagrations that could start if we get homes going in that urban environment. So this is a snapshot of, we think, the highest risk homes with the most loss potential. And when you see the category very high there, as we had done the previous work with our legends and transferred it over to this more understandable legend, that kind of, as I previously looked, would mean greater than 30% of the homes in a hexagon like that would be on fire. And when you have homes at that type of density, that's very similar to the type of thing, you know, we see in a Marshall. That's why we didn't go higher in that in our original numbers, and that's equated to the very high category here you see in this image. But this scale would allow you to strategize and prioritize at a finer scale in communities than I think previous stuff we've had. Next slide. This is up north of Steamboat Springs around Steamboat Lake, if folks know where that is, around Hans Peak. And this is looking at our defensible space composite layer. This is a score of the quality of defensible space that you see around those structures. And so when you see low, that means good defensible space. When you see very high, that means things are bad. Even though it's just something you have to make sure you understand when you use this layer. We will have that in the methodology and the reports, but as you use this layer, be very cognizant of that as you use the legend. But the three metrics we're looking at in this layer are canopy cover, slope, and fuel model. And why those are important, it's based off of a lot of the building damage assessments that's happened out in California to look for characteristics in the defensible space only on vegetation. So the caveats here are we're not looking at the characteristics of the building and its ignition resistance. And we're not factoring those types of things in. We're only looking at vegetation and its certain sample buffers out from the structure. So canopy cover, what they've found in California is in conifer fuels, when you're above about 50% canopy cover, that starts to be more directly correlated with home loss. Slope is fairly explanatory for folks on this call. And then fuel model is important as well, because depending on what fuel models are adjacent to these homes, that is something we're factoring in, you know, based on intensity and other things. Next slide. So we're going to look at one area here that's in Routt County. Again, it's that area we were zooming in on around Steamboat Lake. So if you notice on the things that we're looking at that might be driving the negative defensible space, you're able to drill down to the three metrics to see what are their own separate scores individually to see if any one of them are driving that negative composite score. And in this instance, we've got the worst category with the fuel type that's there, because I know it's lodgepole pine at high density. Next slide. We know the canopy cover is over 50% around the majority of those homes because it's also in the worst category. So if you were trying to strategize on how to maybe change the outcome and increase the quality of defensible space here, a good strategy would be to get this canopy cover for sure less than 50% around a lot of these homes. The other reason we chose the 300-foot buffer distance here is we tried to create a proxy for the branding that's being generated and landing on these structures. And through some good data that's been shared with me from Chad Hoffman and Mike Caggiano and others at CSU, probably about 85% of the firebrands are coming within 100 meters or 328 feet. And that helped to also support, that buffer distance of 300 feet and help us to develop this canopy cover metric of 50% or less out to that 300-foot buffer distance. Next slide. This one here shows you good evidence that it's on flat ground and that slope is not driving that negative score for their quality of defensible space. It's the over 50% canopy cover in lodgepole pine fuels that are adjacent to those structures. So this tool can help you start to figure out some of those things before you might get out to the field and be a little more strategic in what you recommend folks might need to do to change their scoring at this scale. Next slide. This one here is showing you a different way to look at ingress and egress. And this is an area here where on the far left on the image is Boulder, and then you see Louisville. Those are the two urban areas, and Superior, which is below Louisville there. So where you're seeing the colors that are more orange and reddish, there's fairly dense areas there, and it's hard to get folks out. And so that should be a good indication as you develop CWPPs that those kind of areas definitely warrant, further investigation and more detailed evacuation planning. This is, again, a static snapshot here. So when you see areas that are green, it assumes all roads are open during the incident. And for this area we're using as a test here during the Marshall, US 36 was not open. So some areas on this map that color green in this static image during the incident that day would not have been easy to get folks out of. So take those types of things into account as you use this layer, to give you kind of a red flag of where you do need to be doing, more detailed evacuation planning. And we also have the ability to look at this through a social vulnerability lens as well, and turn that off and not look through that lens. So there are the abilities to at least factor that in as well on this layer. Next slide. So here's the few last examples of just some of the better resolution I wanted to highlight. So this is an area just southeast of Boulder and northwest of Louisville, Colorado, that was impacted by part of the Marshall Fire. And you can see the area there that's indicated as Spanish Hills, kind of just coloring out as one color orange with a lighter blue color in there. And you can notice the same on the area where Louisville is in the lower right of the image, where it's just gray in the urban area. You don't see near the things showing up as unmowed and mowed on this image, but when you go to the next one, you can really see how our better resolution at 20 meters here, and it's LiDAR based. I think that's the difference compared to the 30 meters from Landfire we had used previously. In these kind of areas, I can see the unmowed and ungrazed areas showing up a lot better, and that's probably partly due to the object-based image analysis. I can see the mowed areas, which are the hayfields, if folks know them, drive southeast of Boulder up US 36 there before you get to Davidson Mesa. And then the Spanish Hills subdivision, what I've noticed as a pattern here in these types of subdivisions with the finer resolution is we're seeing, the type of fuel models that are actually present in the subdivision, that in that subdivision, they have a lot of grass shrub, and shrub fuel models with a little bit of timber understory. Whereas outside of that, in those pure grasslands, we don't have those shrub and timber understory fuel series models. So it's helping us to see why some of those subdivisions are going to have a higher risk within them compared to the adjacent ecological lands that surround them. You can see on the lower image there where Louisville is, and we've blacked out some of the core urban area where the finer resolution is showing the roads better and other things. Next slide. This one here is just a fire behavior output that's showing you the differences that we're able to see, with this finer resolution, so that it's able to show me mowed areas and what those unmowed areas are. And then more importantly, what's the behavior that's kind of happening in those subdivisions with a lot of the conifer fuels and other things that are kind of being planted at certain densities in between homes. These are, going to be tools, I think, that can allow you to kind of visualize those things for communities when you're needing to have those discussions on CWPPs. Next slide. This is an example of what those redder patches are showing up in that. Go back one slide next so we can make sure to highlight that before I go to this one. Those more reddish patches that are in the Spanish Hill subdivision there, when we go to this next slide, this is the kind of stuff on the ground that we're picking up at that 20 meters resolution with LiDAR. And so for folks on the call that are in the fire service, there is a home right behind these blue spruce with that ladder of juniper right up to them. So these are the types of things that our finer resolution's picking up on, and those kind of developments that I think you can use to your advantage when you're having these community meetings. Next slide. The last ones are with the NCAR fire. As I was doing testing, and our LiDAR for this area had obviously been flown about 2 months after the fire, it was able to show me the effect the fire had on some of the fuels and other things we're interested in, like spotting here. So here we're looking at the 50-mile-an-hour spotting layer, and that burn that happened under the NCAR footprint by the number of trees it's reduced, the surface fuel burning it did and accomplished, it's really reduced the branding potential in the snapshot of when we took this image, and I think that's key. It's a visual way that I know one of the audience members that may be on the call, Chris Warner from City of Boulder and Carrie Webster, you can use these types of images, I think, to show how these types of things can change those outputs for us, create better situations for us to engage under a wider range of conditions. And it's a more visual way to tell those compelling stories to the community versus some of the ways we've shown them, in the past that I've been involved with. Next slide. I think this one, demonstrates it well, where that area is in green and the NCAR fire footprint was previously was red. And so it gives the ability to show those treatment effects and how it really can affect fire behavior upwind of probably one of the highest risk portfolios in the state, South Boulder, the neighborhood I live in. Next slide. This is just giving you an example of a photo there where you see the NCAR fire footprint and what our LiDAR imagery is picking up on, how open it is. You can see the dead and gray trees in there that were kind of killed by heat. But the stuff that's off to the left, you can see why our image was showing that a different color. And this, again, would be a visual that, as I'm meeting with the community, you can match up some of the analysis slides with some of the on-ground photos to show folks this is what it might more visually need to look like to get those colors to change, to give them a better understanding versus some of the numbers I know myself and others have used in the past that the public probably generally doesn't understand when we talk about them. Next slide. And I will turn it back over to Nick for the last of the presentation.
Yeah, thanks, Chad, for giving all those examples. This is the part where, we've gone through the details of most of the layers and talked about some use examples. And I just want to remind everybody how they can use and access all this new information. So the primary platform for CWRA is the Colorado Forest Atlas. So the Atlas currently contains 3 free public applications. 2 of them serve CWRA data and information in some form. So the Wildfire Risk Viewer, the one on the right of the screen, this is formerly the public viewer. So this is a basic application. It has fewer layers. It's geared more towards the general public, homeowners and people just trying to kind of dip their toe into exploring the data, and really gives immediate access to some information based on maybe your home location or property location using a fire intensity point tool. And just like provides more information right off the bat. So there's no account requirements for that application. The Wildfire Risk Reduction Planner, which was formerly the professional viewer, this one is geared towards folks probably on this presentation. And this contains the full suite of data products, tools, you can use to create reports, download the data for specific project areas, and just do a lot more stuff with the data. This does require signing up for a free account through the Colorado Forest Atlas to access the application and the data. So CWRA data is accessible from a number of locations. The best way to use the data is still with the Analyze Project Areas tool in the Wildfire Risk Reduction Planner. So that's the tool that lets you download data layers and reports for a specific area of interest. This tool is being updated with some of the new layers that we've released, some more kind of sections on the analysis and a new kind of look to the whole report. So it's currently inactive in the application, and the planned release is in August, early August. So similarly, the county risk summary reports that are in the wildfire risk viewer, kind of a simplified county-wide version of these reports, will also be released in August 1st. So just additional work we needed to do, but we didn't want to delay the release of the data and the visualizations, just to wait for those to get done. We also are going to have a new file manager application within the Forest Atlas, and this is going to be the location where you can download the Colorado-wide CORA data. And that's going to be accessible by requesting an account and signing up or agreeing to a data sharing agreement through that request. So this will hopefully be up in the next few days. There's some additional work on the back end, just because of how we approve accounts to the Colorado Forest Atlas, and we're trying to make it so that people with existing accounts don't need to do any extra steps. And so ideally, once that is publicly visible, when you open the apps page of the Colorado Forest Atlas, you'll be able to select it and it'll go through a digital basically data sharing agreement that you'll click accept, and then you'll have access to a folder to download the different data themes and all the ancillary data sets as well. So again, I don't think that's currently available last time I checked, but that shouldn't be delayed till August. That should be available in the next couple of days, so keep checking back. The next thing is that CORA data will be posted to ArcGIS Online. We'll provide those layers as streaming tile layers, so you can add those as static layers or base maps to either your online web maps or a desktop GIS. So you won't be able to dynamically change symbology or do analysis on them, but you will be able to add them to a visualization tool. We'll try to do more to upload layers to ArcGIS Online with a little more dynamic abilities in the future. Other tools that are being updated include user interface enhancements across the Forest Atlas. The big ones are the map export redesign. So we're hoping to rearrange things so that the legend can be on the same page as the map. And a few other visualization improvements, and then also pop-up improvements, especially with some of our new layers, some of our vector layers with the hexagons, being able to kind of look at the data, underlying data by clicking on it. And again, those are also slated to be released August 1st. So some documentation for this assessment is still being finalized, but the Forest Atlas is where you can find all the CORA documentation. That includes data theme descriptions within the menu of the application. You can also find CORA reports and metadata on the Forest Atlas support page. One exciting improvement is our help documentation and reports are now going to be hosted online in a public knowledge base. And that'll be a lot easier to go to kind of search the whole knowledge base for what you're interested in finding. We can make updates to that as needed. And you can maybe make bookmarks on your browser for those specific areas, as opposed to having to open a PDF every time you want to read the reports or learn about the data sets. That knowledge base will also include user tutorials for the different tools and getting to know the Forest Atlas and CORA. So that's hopefully going to be a huge improvement for usability. Finally, we're really encouraging partners in the public to use the contact page on the Forest Atlas. And that's for anything related to data access, training needs for the new CORA release, application support, and anything else you might need. This goes directly to the GIS team at the Colorado State Forest Service, and we do generally provide quick support. So our support form there is also going to be updated to provide a little more information from users so that we can get back to people about their specific request a little quicker. So please do send us comments and questions through that system. So this is the last slide. So again, the 2022 CORA layers went live on the Forest Atlas yesterday. We're continuing to make updates to the Forest Atlas applications, probably in through the coming weeks. We'll be hosting another webinar to look a little more in depth at the data and the tools in September. And I think Gloria on the next slide will have a little more information on that. So please do register, because that'll be a better opportunity for folks to really ask questions about data use, tools, other things like that. And then, yeah, please go to the Forest Atlas, coloradoforestatlas.org for, comments and questions. And then the last thing I'll say is we're really excited to let everyone know that we'll be implementing a new update cycle for CORA after this release. So thanks to some funding from Healthy Forest Fiber Communities, we're going to be offering a 3-year update cycle moving forward for these products. So that'll help us update all the underlying information a lot more often, like fuels and value at risk, to kind of regularly keep the product current and useful to everyone. So yeah, thank you for joining today.
Yes, thank you.
That's amazing. That was really very powerful. I think it's one of the most powerful analysis tools that we've seen through a lot of networking in Southern Rockies. You have some really great questions. I have taken some of them out and put them in a Word document so I can group them together. But please feel free. We've allowed for about half an hour of discussion, more or less. So please feel free to continue asking questions. The questions that are, and you're welcome to turn on your video thing and raise your hand. I'm not sure I'll see hands raised because we have like almost 140 people on. So I guess it would be best to post questions in chat, and Becca and Steve of Fire Adapted Colorado can help monitor. One of the most important questions right out of the gate was there was a question about which machine learning algorithm that you're using. There's lots of them out there. Could you start there, and then we can go into some questions about the Sentinel-2 bands?
Sure. Yeah, so they used a random forest model. I don't have any information on the specifics about what else went into that. That was on the Technosylva side. So I can reach out to see if there's a little more information that they would be willing to provide.
Okay. All right. We can make a note of that to get back to our attendees about more information about that. But it was a proprietary algorithm, you're saying, developed by Technosylva?
I believe so.
Okay. All right. And the next question was, some of the Sentinel-2 bands are 10 millimeter spatial resolution, but I noticed this data set is set to 20 meters. Is that because the NIR red edge bands are 20 meters?
Yeah, I think the idea was that most of the bands would be in 20 meters. And so that was what we set it at, as opposed to trying to provide better resolution with data that we couldn't get at that. So, the LiDAR, we could downsample a little bit, and everything else we try to keep within that 20 meter resolution.
Okay. And on the algorithms, Laura Duran posts random forest is a statistical method for classification that is one of the widely used algorithms. It is open source. Laura, if you have a link that you can put in there, it'll be stored in chat and we can share that with attendees later on. Okay, related to algorithms and themes, where could I find more detailed descriptions or algorithms for your themes, e.g. the fire intensity, WUI risk? As much as I appreciate all this work, there are questions about using it or presenting it without much more detail to detailed descriptions of these descriptions and methodology behind your themes. Could you go into that a little bit? Or we could also use this as a topic that we can dive deeper to in September.
Yeah, I do think this is a great topic for then. If you haven't, well, I suppose I can try. Let me get the link for the project document, and I can put that in the chat. And that's where somebody can start with understanding the processing for the themes.
Okay. So we'll refer everybody to a link where you have more information.
Yes.
Okay, fabulous. I love chat. Sometimes it's a great resource. We had a really great question about understory in pinyon juniper. Great progress with pinyon juniper. How does it account for, and please let me know if I'm interpreting the question right. Does it account for the invasion of cheatgrass in the understory in PJ? And in general, I would ask, how is it modifications accounting for your annual invasives?
I can take that one. That is a good question. PJ is a complex fuel type, as folks on the call know. To try to classify that at a statewide scale based on some of the differences that do show up in it. If there's grass present, it does tend to make surface fire spread easier. Cheatgrass is such a fine fuel component, though. What I seem to find with it, and I looked at some sites even as I came back from Idaho through Utah and those areas just yesterday to kind of verify this for myself as I was coming back through a lot of PJ country. I think the wind still has to be present and a major driver. So whether there's cheatgrass present or it's still labeled as timber litter, like our conventional sites, and even when you see a lot of sagebrush packed in, like I saw yesterday, I think the theme though still is you have to have wind present to get fire to spread in that fuel type, even with the cheatgrass. Without wind present, it just doesn't seem to spread when we put a lot of the simulations, the ignition simulations into it. That being said, though, we're trying to classify it at a statewide scale. And so there are going to be some on the ground differences that do show up. So if you do see a lot of grass present at your site, and we aren't indicating juiced up fire behavior outputs in your area, you may want to think about adjusting that a little bit on the, for what you're seeing on the ground. If you see one of those primary carriers of like that, that's going to be a bigger driver. Cheatgrass, though, that's where, again, I think keeping it timber litter may still work due to the fact that there has to be so much wind present, to get that cheatgrass to take off in those pinyon juniper sites. But it is a good question, and I am going to be doing further investigation into how can we pick up more of the variation that's out there in pinyon juniper, because I think looking at the US Forest Service assessment and ours both, we both have had different ways to look at it, but I think we're both right depending on the areas you're at. And again, that's the hardest one to classify. As I've asked some of our, ecologists about it, what they try to share with me that is really the reason it has a fairly long fire return interval, and at least historically has, is those sites really, there aren't many conditions that they want to burn on, and the wind has to be really present to drive that and make it happen. Does that answer the question for who had that?
Hoping so.
Okay.
That was, it scrolled off my screen now.
It was Scott Golden from the city of Boulder.
Scott Golden, okay, thank you.
Boulder County.
Laura, wait, let me back up. Have you compared, Angela Boag asks, have you compared the watershed protection risk theme that you have or layer with the Colorado Water Conservation Board's wildfire ready watersheds susceptibility analysis?
Not to my knowledge.
And I can add to that. We have seen a presentation from the Colorado Water Conservation Board on that new layer that Chris Sturm gave us, I think last fall. Was that correct, Nick, about that time? So
Another one, but yeah.
I think, as I saw that presentation, there probably is some utility, and I know myself, I'll be probably looking at that. And in the next 2 years before we start our update, 3 years from now, this next update, that will be something I'll be probably behind the scenes myself starting to dive into to start to see how that might factor into our composite scoring that we're doing, because one of our layers we use in the composite scoring for wildfire risk to assets is riparian. And we're, having some debates of would there be a better replacement potentially? And that could be a data set that could give us a layer that could potentially replace something there. So that's where I could potentially see some utility in how we could potentially factor it in next time. Yeah. But I think I would agree with Nick. We didn't really do a direct comparison on this assessment to that one at this point yet.
Okay, that might be something, who knows, we might have some follow-up for in September.
Yeah.
And as you're filling out our feedback survey, as I mentioned, we're agency and federally and nonprofit funded, and your feedback is essential to our future planning and programming. There's an open-ended question about feedback that you have for presenters or us. So if you have some topics that you would like to see covered or feedback, make sure that we can circle back around to for September. That's a spot you can also let us know. Laura Duran asks, how was spotting calculated? Is that depicting ember source or ember sinks? That's a really good question.
That is a good question. That's a hard question, Laura. Thanks for that one. I will actually have to look into that, because I've just, at least through the assessment, I've just looked. I believe it's probably, I know it's distance, so I will have to look into that before I really answer that confidently, and I'll get an answer back for you on that. I know in the coal assessment, they did have some different abilities to, I think, look at what you're trying to describe there, that I don't think we went down quite to that level, but I will follow up, with the consultants and get an answer back for you on that one.
Okay. Megan Matonis would like to commend you. This is a tremendous product. Thank you for such a high quality analysis and data set for the state. She has a question about tracking changes over time. The fuel models for the 2022 update are so different from the 2017 and 2012 analyses. Seems like a comparison would pick up methodological changes more than actual changes on the ground. This is a problem with land fire data too, especially comparing older data to the remap in 2016. Although if I'm not mistaken, I think they're now doing annual remaps every year to kind of solve that. Do you have suggestions for how people can assess changes over time with available products?
Boy.
Yeah, that's a tough one. Change over time. Usually the recommendations are based on, presenting issues.
I'll take a stab at that, Meg. I guess when you look at how we've been on 5-year, cycles, that's too long, I think. And now that we're on 3-year cycles, and I hope we stay consistent with that, and thank the legislature for that funding to allow us to be able to do it. And some investment in positions like mine to kind of help interpret, and oversee this stuff than the state had previously. I'm hoping if we stay on these 3-year cycles, that we will be starting to look at, kind of tracking changes and differences, because we made such substantial changes to the fuel layer from the last update to this one. It would be difficult to go back and compare, stuff we were doing previously. We can see what the change is, but I would say more from this point on is where I'm going to be looking at seeing things like treatments that are bigger scale. Do we see changes in fire behavior outputs on the screen as we're doing this every 3 years? Because that might start to be a tool to help us see if you're having the kind of effects you want to have that you're prescribing, in your treatments. So I know I've talked to Ethan in our monitoring group, one of our monitoring specialists with the State Forest Service, about trying to start to devise a way to monitor, at our 3-year increments, things we're seeing and changes on the ground, especially treatment effects, positive or negative, that are coming from the design treatments. So those are some initial thoughts I'm starting to have on tracking, at least on the monitoring side. And that's probably as far as I've taken it at this point, without much more discussion with Nick or others. And again, I think, as you point out, the fact that we changed our fuels so substantially from 2017 to this one, it does make it hard to compare those data sets. The other areas I've started to look at are, areas for the quality of defensible space, where I know we have active programs that are more robust, getting out there and meeting landowners like Wildfire Partners as an example, to start to see if I see effect changes, in any of those types of structures. But what's making that difficult is our buffer distance and sampling distance is out to 300 feet. And a lot of those assessments are only going out 100 feet. So I'm not quite sure yet how to quite compare and correlate those. It may not be so fair to those folks to look at our screen and see if the assessments on the ground are changing the outcome or not, because they're not going out to the distance we are in sampling on ours. So.
Yeah, I guess I don't have anything to add. I'll just add that, our mandate is to provide these snapshots for the benefit of Colorado. And honestly, we try to improve things we talk a lot about, comparability to previous assessments. And sometimes we decide that just doesn't make sense for the, for the benefit of the new assessment. Some layers are directly comparable. And do actually use land fire as an input, and then others, use the new fuels layer, and would be difficult to do. But yeah, that's just a tough question.
All right, that's another one we might be able to dive deeper in as we have more time to work through this. The next question, I believe I have to go back and see who's from. Theme description for fire behavior states more information on the weather inputs can be found in the CORA data. Where would we find that? Chad, you said they use the 97th percentile. For what years? For the whole year? The theme description speaks of a weighted average of 4 percentile classes.
I think I'll let Nick take that, but I think my first stab is that it'll be in those reports that we'll be releasing, right, Nick? But I'll let you kind of take that one.
So this should all be in the final report, which was expected to be put up on the site today, but I'm not seeing the final report. And I think what they're doing is they're taking the final report and they're basically piecemeal updating the knowledge base, which I did put that link in the chat. And so as that gets filled out, you will have more information, but then there will be a static PDF of the full CORA report that'll have all that. But I just shared that knowledge base right now, just so you can bookmark it, because right now that is our only link to documentation. We do have the full fuels report that we can share with people individually. My hope was not to have to do that, but if people are really curious and need stuff by the end of the week, I'm happy to share that out. But otherwise, that will all be on that file explorer or on the knowledge base when it's ready.
Okay, moving along. It seems that the names of some of the outputs are different than what the Forest Service uses in their quantitative wildfire risk assessment process. This is from Laura Duran. Are any of these equivalents? Is there published literature on the methods that point to those? She'd like to be able to see similarities and differences if they're different.
No, that is a good question, Laura. I think there are some things that are labeled different when I've looked at both Cole and ours. And I think, again, probably these reports that Nick's, referred to, that's probably going to be really the best place to look to try to answer those kind of questions, because I'm not as familiar with all these details yet. I've been waiting for the reports as well, to make sure we can read and answer our questions on that. So I'll probably defer it to those reports, at least on that question now, acknowledging that, yes, there are, as I've tried to compare the two data sets, what I can say is they're very comparable on the fuels layers. And that's I think that should give us all confidence that both data sets are very high quality, with what's the input data that's went in on the fuels work up front. They customized their fuel models. We customized ours. They shifted more things to timber understory, just like we did. I really saw a lot of alignment around the rest of the state, most of the state, in comparable, quality on the two data sets there. It was really probably in the Pinyon Juniper where we had some discrepancies, and those are describable just based on what fuel models we chose to place there. So. But I think the outputs, you're correct. There was a little more tilting probably on coal towards more operational type files that I would expect, like IMTs, would find very useful. Some of the things that we've got, are very different, and were kind of intended for more planning at fine scales, like the building, the building layer, the defensible space of some of those, which were fairly new, even in my exposure to them. So, but we'll wait for these reports. I think take a good deep dive into those. If those questions still aren't answered, we can do some follow-up work with you on that.
Oh, great networking. Wonderful. Let's see. One more question. John Walker asks, given the increasing number of burn scars and increased frequency of extreme precipitation events, which we've seen a lot of, do we have enough LiDAR data to map a spectrum of flood inundation zones, particularly in watersheds with vulnerable communities and transportation corridors? Becca Samolsky responded with a question, would that be more of a wildfire-ready watersheds output? And with that, this is the last question that I'm seeing other than discussions. If folks would want to unmute themselves and put their videos on and join more of a discussion format, we have about 10 more minutes.
Gloria, this is Steve. I think there was a question about which machine learning algorithm was used. I think it was early in the presentation.
Yeah, we got to that. Nick was answered that it was he thinks it was a proprietary algorithm developed by Technosylva.
Okay, thank you. Yeah,
at least for John's question there, what was that again that John had just asked you had referred to?
Given the increasing number of burn scars and increased frequency of extreme precip events, do we have enough LiDAR data to map a spectrum of flood inundation zones, especially in watersheds with vulnerable communities and transportation corridors?
Well, I think what I first think of when I hear that question for sure is probably the work CWPPs been involved with, that we had presented to us would be probably a place to start. I also know FEMA has remapped a lot of floodplains in previous years. When I was with watershed coalitions, that's not something we specifically looked at on here. And I don't know, I'd have to let Nick speak to the, the type of LiDAR data and if it even has that capability for us. But I think CWPP is probably looking at that with their, wildfire watershed risk things that they showed us back in the fall. And maybe Angela Bogue would know more about that, who might still be on the call.
Okay, that's good. Ellie Solis, have there been specific changes geared towards higher alpine forest types, such as lodgepole pine and spruce fir, to make it more accurate besides changing the fuel model?
Yeah, I'll take that one on because I've had a lot of discussion with people about spruce fir and lodgepole pine and those systems. What we did do on the values at risk rating was try to feel comfortable in rating spruce moderate statewide on that layer. And the caveats for why on that one increasing compared to what we had previously was that we've got a changed fuel condition in spruce with the bark beetle activity that's occurred at scale. And that does lead to some uncertainty in, the future for that. We also, I've seen one thing that gave me confidence on it, I'll be quite honest to the group, probably one of the more driving factors is when I looked at the West Fork complex in 2013, probably the dust on snow events, the severity and frequency of those in 2012 and 2013 were a fairly big driver on eliminating that snowpack off those south slopes, a total of about 5 extra months over 2 years to get that type of fuel drying. I think that really showed how that type of event, those type of events that are increasing, especially due to land use down in the Four Corners area, those are the unintended consequences we're seeing where it may potentially open up some windows in spruce in June, that we prior had not had, as well as climate change can be factored into that. Because previously in spruce, you don't have a lot of time between snowmelt and monsoon start to dry out fuels. But if you can increase that spring window by these other events doing it, that started to give me a little more confidence on raising, some of that, at least the values at risk, to moderate and wanting to support that. Lodgepole pine is difficult because it's, we've improved it by taking it from a timber litter 1, which showed no expected fire behavior at a 97 percentile condition. And I think that would be hard to believe. But a timber understory meets those, expectations under those conditions. But we're still not capturing the fuel profiles that have changed in lodgepole pine due to the bug activity and the mountain pine beetle activity in particular. And so some things I'm going to be exploring in before the next update are how do we capture that more effectively? Can we develop some custom fuel models for different mortality categories like 0 to 20, 20 to 40, 40 to 60, and 60% plus, specific to lodgepole, specific to mixed con, specific to spruce, and then apply those custom fuel models where we have the spatial data that shows those mortality categories. If we can also then line that up with kind of stand age and density, something I've spoken with quite a few folks, that have mentored me over the years in the expert world, is trying to find a way to use FIA data, our forest inventory and analysis data that's collected at good intervals, to see if we can get some age profiles at scale to match up against historical range of variability, HRV, to see if our overall age profiles are near, where you would expect maybe significant disturbance, especially when it aligns with certain fuel models, bug damage, or high density, stand densities. And so I think what that means is a 120-year-old lodgepole pine stand, maybe we introduce a new layer or way to show risk to those kind of high elevation, low probability systems that due to age, stand density, and fuel profile that's changed, maybe you could say, hey, that's got a significant chance of significant disturbance in the short term versus a 30-year-old lodgepole pine stand that may not have those changes imposed on it and is much younger and may have a low risk of significant disturbance in the short term. So I am going to spend a lot more time looking at the spruce fir, lodgepole pine, where there's insect damage for sure, and trying to relate risk in some different ways where we have longer intervals. And then also looking at the mixed conifer where we're getting a lot of insect damage, especially in southern Colorado, in different species that are within that zone. Hopefully that answers your question.
Should people go direct to Nick or Chad for follow-up questions? Or are there perhaps local Colorado State Forest Service folks trained who could provide support at this time? I'm sure as time goes on, State Forest Service folks will be much more versed in this, but
the one thing I'll mention to that, and I'll let Nick speak as well here from his viewpoint from GIS, but we will have 4 wildfire resilience coordinators that are going to be on around the state, 1 in each area. They're a new position the state's invested in, really trying to make sure those folks are very knowledgeable about, everything we do and what CORA has been about, and how to interpret these layers. they're learning that stuff now. So they will become assets for you to start interacting with as you get to know them in your areas. For the time being, though, Nick and I's preference is really not to contact us directly. It's to go through that website and make sure you give your feedback, ask questions that way. It's a more efficient way for us to track it, make sure we answer them. It'll defer questions to me or others on his staff, depending on what the topics are. And I'll let him share a little more about that as well.
Yeah, that's right on, Chad. Yeah, if folks can please use the contact form on the Colorado Forest Atlas. That'll come to my team, but then we distribute those questions depending on who can best answer them. So that helps us kind of, not have to pass around emails. It just goes directly to who best can answer the question. So that's your best bet if you have any additional questions.
And then lastly, I'll be working with our forestry supervisors that the State Forest Service has on our old Forest Service district type of a structure that's out there in our field offices. So those folks will have access to me. And so they're also folks that are going to become more knowledgeable about this as time goes on, just like our resilience coordinators, because they'll both those groups will have access to me if there's things that get asked of them that are more complex over time as they start to, increase their knowledge of it. So they haven't looked at it as much as I have the last few months. So they haven't gotten their exposure up quite yet to the level I've had with this one. So.
Okay, good to know. I just wanted to address, we're coming up on the end. And as I said, if folks want to pop up, I don't have everybody's name boxes on one screen, but if you'd like to unmute and pop in, that's okay. Laura addressed something that's of concern, an ongoing concern to a lot of us in the business, for the wider audience, to address similar risk modeling efforts, and goodness knows there's plenty of them out there, with so many entities doing them, we collectively might consider how we can overall better coordinate so we don't create so many competing and similar data sets. And in addition to what agencies do, there's private companies also producing their own information. It's hard to keep up. Just as an informed fire fuel staff, I would think it'd be confusing to decision makers in the public, which I'm sure it is. Lots of folks reacted positively and thumbs up to that. Philip Brinkman says at the end, addressing to homeowner associations, should they be using this tool as part of their FireWise risk assessments? Perhaps some guidance notes read FireWise. I don't know, Phil, if you want to elucidate what you mean by that a little bit more.
I'm part of the Grand County Wildfire Council. One of our public engagement tools is the NFPA FireWise community engagement tools and annual registration process where they have to document work done on their community education alike. And a base element of FireWise is an initial risk assessment. And in rural communities, we don't necessarily have enough practitioners, certainly the guys at Colorado State Forest are great, to generate a community-wide risk assessment that is required for a community to use this tool. So as you talk about perhaps more layman users of this nice tool, how could you simplify some notes so that they can get they need at a community level, which is usually a neighborhood, couple of square miles at best kind of scale?
Hey, no, I appreciate the question. And I don't know if Todd Ruffner's still on the call, but he being my equivalent, I will for sure chat with him about that since he's our FireWise kind of coordinator, from the State Forest Service. An excellent question, but I will do some follow-up with him just to get his take on how he views, kind of this assessment, in relation to FireWise. But my initial take on it is that, the quality of what we've got here and the scale you can go down to, mainly because as I've tested it and looked, those 28-acre hexagon shapes, when you can get 2 or 3 of those, showing up in a subdivision to get to that scale of about 100 acres, it helps you can see where the risk is the worst and where you need to develop strategies. So I would start to think that would offer some utility it's a lot of these subdivision scales that, you start working at for Firewise communities. But I will follow up with Todd Ruffner and we can get back to you a little bit on that.
Thanks.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thanks for the question though.
This is job security for Chad and Nick. They have a lot to do, a lot to follow up. Laura asked one more question. There's a few more comments and questions, and then we'll have to wrap it up in a few minutes. For conifers, especially lodgepole pine, affected by bugs and crud, not just the percentage of the stand affected, but also red needle versus gray stage versus increased CWD / snag fall would need to be considered. I know that that's been a challenge for land fire to incorporate in their modeling. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, she's definitely factoring in the complexities as to why it's going to take us 2 years to kind of investigate how to be ready at the next update to approach that. And I bet I'll be reaching out to folks like you, Laura, to kind of have those discussions of how do we factor in all those complexities. It is difficult when you're doing it at more of a statewide scale versus finer scales to try to capture all of that. So I don't quite have I think they do need to be factored in, like you say, the different phases. Luckily, I think at least in lodgepole, probably a high percentage of the activities occurred. But I can't, mixed conifer, that wouldn't be the case. We're seeing a lot of increasing activity there, and I don't think all the spruce has been hit yet. So yeah, factoring in those different phases and other things like you brought up there would be good to consider, and I will be considering those.
John Walker posted one more technical question that I guess I missed. Did CWRA input RAWS type data to identify repetitive mountain wind flow patterns that can have a significant impact on rate of spread and other spread factors?
That is a good question, and I know the type of complexity he's trying to go for there. I will do a little follow-up on that. My guess is that they probably didn't do further analysis other than just bringing the data in and modeling on it. But I can follow up to see if they did anything further. But if for what you described there, those types of things could potentially be factors that we haven't considered, yes. But at the statewide scale, I guess I'm not sure how much of an effect they would have versus finer scales, but I will follow up on that for you since we've got the recording of this.
Yeah, and this will be represented in the chat too.
Okay.
With that, unless anybody wants to pop on verbally real quick, we'll wind this up. Thank you so much, Nick and Chad. This is an incredible amount of work, and congrats also to Technosylva. I don't know if any of them are represented here. I'm hoping that some of them will be able to join us for our more technical discussion in September. Will we have Technosylva on then?
We will try to have somebody from Technosylva be present at the next session for sure.
Okay, great. And the format we're exploring is having just a real brief overview of a couple of these examples. And then as people have a few months to play around with this and explore it, and CWRA team helps to develop it a little bit, we might have breakout sessions and divide people into groups with a breakout leader so we can explore and answer some of these questions in smaller groups. I'm not sure we'll do that. We'll be working on that, so be sure to let us know. Anne, did you have a question?
I did. My name is Ann Walker. I'm a private consultant based in Portland, but prior experiences were in Colorado with Western Governors Association during the time that Governor Hickenlooper was chairman of Western Governors Association. And they had developed task groups, one of them specifically on the insurance and wildfire situation. And one of the key recommendations had to do with CORAP and the future use of the analysis with determining, homeowner insurance and such. Do you have any connection still with that Rocky Mountain Insurance Information Association, Carol Walker's group?
I'll take that on. Yes. I actually just did we created a presentation with her, Carol Walker, and Ulrich, who Salzberger, who was representing the Colorado Realtors Association. And we co-presented that in Vegas a few weeks ago at the National Fire Protection Association conference back in June. And so I did have quite a few meetings with Carol and showed her some of this stuff and asked some questions, of what her thoughts were about this and where things were kind of heading. And of course, at that time was when we saw California, I think it was Farmers Insurance or State Farm, decide not to offer new policies there. What Carol shared with me, as I asked that with her, is that a lot of insurance companies do like to have their own proprietary information, their own proprietary data sets. They do a lot of big risk modeling on all kinds of risks, and fire is one of the smaller components of that for a lot of those companies, as you know.
Usually flooding is higher.
But it's increasing fast, obviously, as we all on this call know. And so right now, she doesn't see insurance companies using our data in a manner that's regulatory like that. We also have on our website that it's not for commercial purposes either. And so I think that's key to point in on. It's really for information, and we want to make sure it's as high quality as it can be and unbiased so homeowners can make choices, see things that they want to see on it, and that there's utility for, planners and others. Down the road, could it ever be used in a regulatory manner? It could potentially. The Colorado has pushed legislation for a WUI board. And I could see potentially this data set being considered if that WUI board once it starts meeting and if they decide to enact WUI code. My concern that I shared, in the meetings with Carol and Ulrich is when we talked about disclosure with realtors, or we talked about mandates with rules and then do what the recommendations are, but really the assessments are key. And if you're using and I think Laura Duran alluded to this earlier, there's a lot of assessments out there.
Yeah.
If we were to mandate you have to do something, depending on which assessment you might use, boy, if it was an inaccurate assessment and then you were going to make an economic decision on that, that makes me feel a little uncomfortable. But if we can make sure it's a higher quality data set that's factored in to those type of scenarios, and that's where I think like our data set and the US Forest Service data set are examples of much higher quality data sets, that's probably our role, is providing that, being the arbiter of data and making sure we try to provide unbiased data sets at higher quality. That's where then insurance and realtors can, like as Ulrich said, they can do their job as a guide, as a realtor, to make sure to direct you to a higher quality site to go make your decisions versus just say, go look at risk assessments. Do a little better job of directing them to things that we know are more accurate and higher quality. That I think is something we're going to be for sure trying to work on. And ours will be more front and center for those reasons,
Well, and Chad, I got to tell you, the eye is on Colorado, and as well as Oregon. And what has happened, if you're not familiar, the statewide assessment was scrapped with the very clear, obvious intent to regulate and increase insurance as well as taxes. So a government or publicly paid for assessment has obvious connections to that application to a private landowner. So it's different.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that Oregon process and talked to some of the folks who were involved in the development. And I think what we're trying to do differently here is take a different approach, where we're trying to give this information, let folks digest it themselves. And what's driving me in this position is how do we try to engage folks differently for outcome changes, And I'm very open-minded to that right now. And I know Carol was, with the insurance group, as well as Ulrich from Realtors. And that's why we wanted to go to present there, was show our relationship. And I feel it's getting stronger as time goes on. So,
well, I just would hate to have the same thing happen to what you guys have done here. I think it's phenomenal. I have a lot of respect for Buckley and the other folks at Technosylva. And I think that Colorado has stepped out with the leadership of, you know, former Governor Hickenlooper and now in a congressional position. I really do think there is a clear stair step to national legislation that would really help the states figure out a way to utilize these, you know, higher technology type tools to inform and educate and influence, you know, the local landowners.
Yeah, I think what I can add to that is I was just in Idaho this weekend for a wedding. And my new stepmother was the sheriff who just retired in Valley County, Idaho there. And I did show this to her this weekend.
Good.
And I guess what I heard in comments
That is
from
not
her,
wedding stuff to do.
Right.
Just saying.
what I heard from her, as well as the fire chief who was in 6th grade when I graduated high school there, and I showed this stuff to him as well, is they were amazed that they don't have that in Idaho right now. Their state hasn't invested in that. So what I want to say on the call is, you know, our legislature, even though we can badmouth politicians, they have stepped up. They've
Totally
funded a lot of this. They've increased our cycle that we can go to 3 years now. They've funded positions like myself and others to help interpret it. I think I see a lot of benefit in what they're doing on the investment side in our state right now. And I really wanted to make sure folks on the call know that, you know, that's what's allowing us to do all this and do the assessments, help you interpret them, have some staffing on these resilience coordinators and others around the state. I think that's going to offer a lot more utility than what we've had before. So,
right. Washington State has done some of that similar with putting in coordinators and such and working with communities. And Oregon does too. You know, they have them in place already. But I really have liked how Colorado really took the governor's report, you know, back in the day and the different task groups and activated the Air Corps that they talked about, the compact, you know, and the insurance recommendations. So I really do think that you guys have been, you know, very, you know, forward thinking on all of this. So hats off to you guys. I just would hate to have something happen like what happened in Oregon happen with what's going on with this. I think you guys are much further down the road and much more collaborative than what that initial process was in Oregon, which there was kickback from a lot of the ag areas, which tend to be the quieter. They're busy out, you know, doing their harvesting or whatever, and not sitting on Zoom. So they don't necessarily weigh in all the time, but they still have a voice and can make a difference on an assessment. You know, if you're assessing a pole barn, that's the same as you would a, you know, $1 million house that has consequences.
no, thanks for the comments.
Sure. Thanks for the discussion and letting us go along, Gloria. I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Really hoping it's wonderful to hear with all the complexity and challenges that we have in the Southern Rockies region. As the director of the Southern Rockies Fire Science Network, we embrace something like 10 different fuel model areas. That's what's left over after, you know, you define the Great Basin and Great Plains and areas to the north and south. And plus you toss some really unpredictable wind and fuel models in there and a complex political and economic structure in there, and we're scrambling. So I'm delighted to hear that this is being so positively received. With that, I'm going to have to, I'm going to stop recording. Thank you. This will be posted on the Southern Rockies Fire Science YouTube channel. And we will be turning in the list for Society of American Foresters credits and sending out announcements. And if you like what you see, go to Fire Adapted Colorado and get their newsletter, or just as good, go to the Southern Rockies Fire Science Network website and become a SoRocker and get region-wide newsletters and events. And I will stop the recording.